Welcome to the Poisoning Podcast. I'm your host, Erin DeLulo. Today we have Philip Eil joining us. He is a freelance journalist based in Rhode Island who has award-winning work and has been published in such magazines as The Atlantic, and also has taught journalism at schools like Brown University. Welcome to the podcast, Philip.
Thank you so much for having me, Erin.
Oh, so glad you're here. You were in West Virginia, was it last month, to promote your book, Prescription for Pain. And I'm sorry I couldn't be there. Not in my part of West Virginia, but maybe.
Apparently it's not like Rhode Island, where if you're in the state, you're within an hour's drive. That's new to me.
You mean you don't put your hand up to be like, this is what my state looks like?
I don't, although I did go to school in Michigan where they do their version.
Yes. Yeah, we have to have the hand. There are states that have hand gestures. But we're here to talk about your book, which I have, Prescriptions for Pain, which reads like a true crime novel, but it's actually a true story. And why we're having you here on this podcast is because it deals with the opioid and fentanyl crisis.
It does.
So, and how a Dr. Volkman was a promising, valedictorian, then is now serving several life sentences. So introduce us to Dr. Volkman.
Well, you teed it up a little bit right there. Dr. Paul Volkman. So there have been hundreds of doctors convicted of prescription drug dealing over the course of the opiate epidemic. I've looked, I don't know for sure there have been cases in every state, but there have certainly been cases in the majority of states. And some states like West Virginia, like Florida, like Ohio, have been particularly hard hit. Of all of those doctors, no doctor has received a longer sentence than Volkman. He was sentenced to 4 consecutive life terms in prison for prescription drug dealing. His sentencing took place in federal court in Cincinnati in 2012. So that's one reason why this case sticks out. It sticks out for me personally because I have something of a personal connection to Paul Volkman. He was not a guy who I knew growing up, but I would later learn that he went to college and medical school with my dad, first at the University of Rochester, and then they got MD PhDs together at the University of Chicago. So I learned about his case and I learned about him about 15 years ago when I was just starting out in journalism. I was 23 years old. I had a lot of energy and ambition and not necessarily a keen awareness of my limitations as a journalist. And I had recently read Truman Capote's In Cold Blood. So this is what was going on. I've been inspired by Truman Capote, and I learned that this guy who my dad had gone to med school with, who he had fallen out of touch with, was at that point indicted on these really horrifying federal prescription drug dealing charges. Prosecutors said that between 2003 and 2006, Volkman had been operating out of cash-only pain clinics in Appalachian, Southern Ohio, that he was prescribing prodigious amounts of opiate painkillers, as well as sedatives like Valium and muscle relaxers like Soma. Prosecutors said that his clinics accepted only cash, that there were guns on hand to maintain order, and most awfully, prosecutors said that a number of his patients had died from apparent overdoses as a result of this criminal activity. So I hear about this. My dad is a nerdy, mild-mannered, soft-spoken guy. He's still a practicing endocrinologist in Massachusetts and in Rhode Island. And I say in the book, I'm not sure he's ever gotten so much as a speeding ticket. So to hear that this guy, my dad, knew someone who was in this extraordinary position of being federally indicted, I was fascinated. And to make a very long story short, I've pursued this story to a greater or lesser extent for the last decade plus. And it's finally out earlier this year in book form.
Now, Paul Volkman, obviously he made it through several years of graduate school because he has a medical degree and a PhD?
Yes. So
Okay.
that was another thing that caught my attention about the case was Volkman has an MD and his PhD is in pharmacology, which is the study of how drugs affect the body. So I say at one point in the book, of all people who should have known what he was doing and the dangers and the potential consequences, it was Paul Volkman, MD, PhD.
And he didn't start out working at cash pain clinics. He's made numerous errors in his career, whether he would admit that or not, to get him in this position.
Right. So when I first learned about this story, I knew very little beyond the fact that Paul and my dad had graduated in the mid 70s from the University of
Mhm.
Chicago and that Volkman had been indicted in 2007. The interim 30 plus years were a mystery to me. And they were a mystery to my dad, too, because he had fallen out of touch with Paul and couldn't really account for what happened. So, a big part of my research and reporting on this story was figuring out what happened in those, what turned out to be very consequential years, because even according to prosecutors, Volkman's criminal activity didn't start until 2003 when he was well into his 50s. He had had decades
Wow.
of a medical career. And as you say, it turned out to be a kind of weird, meandering career. He started out in medical research. That didn't really pan out for reasons he says were one thing and the people around him say were another. That's a recurring theme in Volkman's life. He says one version of a story. I, a journalist, tried to track down what really happened. From there, he goes into pediatrics. He's living and working in Chicago, and he has some success in pediatrics. Some patients and their families, whom I tracked down, did say good things about him. But he found that he was married, he had a growing family. He apparently wasn't making the kind of money he wanted in pediatrics. So in the 80s and 70s, even, he starts moonlighting in local emergency rooms in Chicago on nights and weekends. And over time, he finds that he can make even more money taking temporary, what are called locum tenens positions at emergency rooms around the Midwest. So over the course of around 20 years, he works at dozens of hospitals. He gets medical licenses in 6 states. And over the course of between the 1980s and the early 2000s, he has sued a number of times for medical malpractice. And these lawsuits stem from both his work in pediatrics and in emergency medicine. Volkman, for his part, who still maintains his innocence on the criminal charges, also maintains that he did nothing wrong in these earlier cases where he was sued for malpractice. But juries and or insurance companies thought otherwise. Two of these malpractice cases went to jury trials and judgments against him. Another two were settled by his insurers. And by the early 2000s, these cases pile up to an extent where medical insurers say, we're done here. We are not going to insure you anymore. And at that point, without malpractice insurance, Volkman's his prospects for getting medical employment were severely limited. And at that point, he makes the fateful decision to answer an ad for a cash-only pain clinic in Southern Ohio.
Did he ever admit to you in all your time interviewing him that was this like a glamorous job to him, something he wanted?
Being a pain doctor?
Yeah, in a pain clinic, cash pain clinic with guns to keep order. Wow.
No. When you use the word admit in
Yes.
Volkman, there isn't much.
Oh.
He is
Oh.
not a guy who admits too much of any wrongdoing, any bad judgment. In all of my time interviewing him, and I interviewed him extensively in person and also corresponded with him in county jail when he was awaiting sentencing and later federal prison, he would only admit that becoming a doctor was a bad decision. Pretty much after
Okay.
that, and even then, he wasn't really being self-effacing. He was kind of chalking this up to his own youth and naivete. Basically, from that point forward, he maintained, and all the time I spoke to him, that his judgment, his practice of medicine were more or less perfect, and that it was other people who were to blame for all the problems that arose. Um, so when it came to his, as you say, kind of sketchy, seedy surroundings in these pain
Yeah.
clinics, he would either act as if they were completely normal or defend them in some way, such as to say that he was a experienced physician who was treating people in a rural and poor and underserved area. But he would rarely say anything like, "Look, I know how sketchy this looks." He wouldn't do that.
Well, the one thing that struck me was greed.
Yeah.
And that's how this opioid and now fentanyl epidemic started with the Sacklers and Oxy, which was greed. How
But
much?
greed packaged in a way so as to seem palatable to the general
Yeah,
public
of course. We want to
and to
make
the
you feel better. You shouldn't have to have any pain post
right, greed
whatever.
under the guise of relieving suffering, of treating undertreated pain, of giving
Hmm.
people their lives back. That is the story of the early days of the opiate epidemic, is wrapping greed in this righteous covering of I'm actually helping people.
And Dr. Volkman played right into that in the pill mills.
He
Now,
did.
how much was he really making?
Well, that's a
Did they
good
figure that
question.
out? You know,
I,
I'm
I
curious.
So I did, and this requires getting into some of the nuts and bolts of the kind of criminal activity. So
Yeah.
Volkman arrives in southern Ohio, a town called Portsmouth, which is right on
Hmm.
the Ohio-Kentucky border, 2 hours south of Columbus, a kind of down on its luck former industrial town that's also part of the Appalachian part of Ohio. So he arrives and he goes to work for a woman named Denise Huffman, who was from
Hmm.
across the river in Kentucky. Denise Huffman is kind of a odd couple partner for Volkman. He has this sparkling resume. She has no medical training whatsoever, doesn't even have a college degree, had worked in fast food restaurants and in factories, and at some point later in her life decided, according to her, that opening a high volume prescribing pain clinic was a business that the area could benefit from. So I bring this up because for really the bulk of Volkman's time down in southern Ohio, and I should note that he was living in Chicago this whole time and
Yeah.
commuting 400 miles away on a weekly basis. He would fly to Columbus, drive down 2 hours to Portsmouth on Monday, and do the reverse on weekends. So he was kind of the caricature of the outsider doctor who was not invested in this local community where he was practicing. And for most of the time down there, he was a salaried employee. And
Hmm.
I think he was getting to start $5,000 a week, which maybe went up to $5,500 a week, which is without question a lot of money.
Yeah.
And during his federal trial in Cincinnati, during Denise Huffman's testimony, prosecutors entered into evidence his tax documents, which showed the exact amounts that he had made from his salaried paychecks over the course of the three some odd years he worked with her. And it totaled up over about 2.5 years to like $650,000 around there, which is a lot of money,
Yeah.
but not necessarily the amount that you would expect a highly qualified doctor to kind of break bad due to. Now,
Yeah.
with that said, there's a couple caveats I would add. Volkman, after his split with Denise in September of
Hmm.
2005, would continue to practice in the area or deal drugs, according to prosecutors, for another 5 months or so. And at that point, he became his own boss, and whatever proceeds from his clinics he earned after his costs went into his pocket. So even by his own admission, his revenues went way up during that last part of his activity down there. But I think and at that point he told me without any kind of hint of self-awareness that he was on track to make over $1 million during the year he was shut down. And he felt this was what
Okay.
a decent living, according to him. And that's certainly, I think, a lot of money then, a lot of money now. But what's key to really understand Volkman and the financial motivations, because I do think the financial motivations were real, is he took this job in the first place because he was desperate, because he was living on Lakeshore Drive in Chicago in a fancy building overlooking the lake, because his rent was $4,500 a month, and because he had recently found out, due to this lack of malpractice insurance, that he was uninsurable. So he literally told me, and I wish he had said more about this, that at one point he was so desperate for work, he was chopping vegetables in a restaurant kitchen, presumably like a minimum wage job, a guy with an MD, PhD, and
Wow.
some serious bills to pay. Not to mention the I think shame and anger that would have gone with doing such work for a guy like him. So behind the maybe not as eye-popping sums of money as you might expect, I think was a lot of desperation financially and psychological desperation too. This was a guy who didn't believe he deserved to be kicked out of medicine and had something to prove.
I find it fascinating that he commuted from Chicago still because it gave him separation from his family life to the bad work he was doing. Um, Did the Huffmans pay for his commute? Was that also something they covered? Because that would add up pretty fast as well.
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. You're right.
I mean, I
I
can't
don't.
imagine 4 round trip tickets every week,
Right.
or every month to
I,
get to
I'm I'm
work.
fascinated. I'm fascinated by the commute too, and I'm glad you
Yeah,
mentioned it for a few reasons. There is that separation, and I
right.
talk in the book about how I interviewed a lot of people from Volkman's Chicago world who, people he played bridge with, or his therapist even, or family members who kind of believed his version of what happened.
Mhm.
And they did because he's a very convincing guy, he's very bright, but also, as I say, they couldn't exactly swing by just to check it out because it was 400 miles away.
Yeah.
I want your viewers and listeners to find a place on a map that's 400 miles from where they live and think about commuting there on a weekly basis. It's extraordinary. But it was also interesting because through this one story, Volkman was this kind of commuting back and forth between these really different places in American life. The glitziest
Yes.
part of one of the biggest cities of Chicago, this international cosmopolitan city, and this really small down and out town where the Rust Belt and Appalachia overlap. And there were very few people, aside from me, his biographer, who made that commute in his footsteps and set foot in both worlds. And I wanted to convey the distance, literal and figurative, between those places to my readers.
Yeah, two very different places. I've actually had Dale King on as a guest earlier.
Hmm.
He's in Portsmouth and he's partnered with the Counseling Center, who I
Hmm.
believe you've been in touch with or talked to them in your research. And
Yeah.
it's a place that was devastated by this epidemic.
Absolutely. I mean, some of your listeners may recognize Portsmouth because over time, and this was another reason I was so fascinated by this story, Portsmouth was among a few towns that really became known as epicenters for the entire opiate
Yeah.
epidemic. Sam Quinones refers to it as such in his excellent book, Dreamland. He calls it, ground zero for the pill epidemic. He basically attributes the invention of the pill mill to this area of southern Ohio and across the river in Kentucky. So, and it's worth noting that despite Volkman's claims of innocence, I did a lot of historical research, and at one point, in combing through files in the local public library, found a newspaper clipping from 2003, the year he arrived in town. And already at that point, this article showed that mayoral candidates were debating in Portsmouth whether the town deserved the nickname the OxyContin capital of the world. So
Mm.
he
Mm.
could have, and I think should have known the kind of place he was walking into to start prescribing so aggressively.
So what, he's serving 4 life sentences now?
Yeah.
Okay, so you mentioned in his trial there were people who testified on his behalf,
Yeah.
or
I mean, so yes, there were. I benefited as a journalist from Volkman's arrogance and ego in a couple ways. I
hmm
benefited because he agreed to speak with me at length. I made no promises to him. And I have a mountain of his written and spoken words that I drew from in this book. But I also benefited from his arrogance and his ego because, unlike the majority of defendants in criminal cases of any kind, but particularly federal cases, he refused to take a plea deal. And
yeah.
so his case went to a trial, which is pretty rare in cases of pain doctors being charged or really any kind of federal case. And during that federal trial, 70 witnesses testified for the prosecution, former patients, law enforcement, medical experts, coroners, and forensic toxicologists, family members of deceased patients, on and on and on. Denise and Alice Huffman, the founder of the clinic, and her daughter. And yes, to your question, 10 experts testified on Volkman's behalf. Volkman himself declined to testify, which he later blamed his defense attorneys for convincing him to do, or, I don't think he has a leg to stand on. He could have done
The
it.
blame game is his that's his nickname.
It's his MO. Everything's somebody else's fault. But it was interesting to read his defense witnesses' testimony because this case was about two different sides. one which claimed this guy was a prolific drug dealer, and another which claimed this guy was a compassionate and conscientious pain doctor. And that testimony really came down to experts at the end of the day. And so each side called multiple experts to argue that their belief that this was outside the boundaries of legitimate medicine and people died as a result, versus the defense, which said this was within the boundaries of medicine. And when people died, it was because they didn't take the medications as prescribed, or they argued because virtually all of these deceased patients had underlying health conditions, which I think was a pretty big stretch for jurors to believe that all these people in their 30s and 40s and 50s had just died from heart disease.
Did you encounter a lot of bias towards the people with addiction? Like, is that one of the reasons you think these people testified for the defense, that they're just, addicts do this to themselves? They were wanting it?
Well, there was a notable moment from a defense expert, a pain expert, who was called to testify that he felt Volkman was within the boundaries of medical practice. And that testimony included one of the most contentious moments of the trial, and also I think one of the ugliest, when faced with the decision of who to blame in an interaction where a patient of Volkman's who was had a history of drug abuse maybe misrepresented her symptoms or lied to him. Who is to blame when that happens, the doctor or the patient? And in arguing, it was the patient's. And by the way, I do think there is certainly a conversation to be had there. It is blurry, and that's one of the reasons why I was interested in covering this story. But in the lengths that this expert goes to defend Volkman, he really kind of smears this deceased patient who is no longer around to defend herself. He calls her a manipulator, calls her a liar. And I think it's a moment when some of that bias really shone through. And the prosecutor, not surprisingly, wasn't having it and pushed this expert really hard, saying at one point, who's the professional here, the doctor or the patient? And so, yes, I did encounter some of the bias you described. And even, I was recently there on a book tour, and at one event, and by no means was this representative of the entire experience, but one person raised their hand and asked, what can we do around here to teach people about this character flaw of addiction? And I offered a response to that, basically saying, I don't think you'll find any literature among experts that supports this idea that addiction is a character flaw. But I was actually grateful this guy said that, because in doing so, he gave voice to a stigma and a bias that's still all too common out there among the general public.
Very true. Do you carry naloxone, either in your house, in your car?
That is a good question. And
Uh-oh. I put you on the
I,
spot.
you did. And I do, and I don't. I
Okay.
don't because generally I don't have it on me, but I do because as a gift at one of my West Virginia events in Huntington, actually, I received some naloxone from some public health officials who kind of ceremoniously gave it to me, and I was honored and touched by that. So, but to
Good.
answer your question, I don't have a good answer. I should, and I don't, but I do have the naloxone that the folks in West Virginia gave me. But you're right, I should have it.
Well, I mean, reading this makes me, and being involved in this work, just now, I just think we should have it everywhere because of how many people are dying a day from it. And you never know who you'll encounter. I didn't know if doing this research would have just been like, okay, maybe I just need to keep some in my car, or even if you aren't struggling with addiction, you never know who you come across.
It's a great point. And I remember I'm now I live in Rhode Island, and
Yeah.
initially when I was working on this story in 2009, 2010, the opiate epidemic was well underway at that point, but it hadn't really reached every corner of the country yet. And I
Sure.
remember as a local journalist here writing about its arrival here and writing about the arrival of fentanyl in Rhode Island. And in that time, I think it was in 2014, I wrote an explainer type piece about what is naloxone for a Rhode Island audience. So it's high time I did carry some with me, and it was always very kind of symbolic that when I was driving from Rhode Island to Ohio, I remember stopping at rest stops on the highway and walking into the rest stop or the bathroom and seeing on the wall, a sign that said something like Ohio overdose prevention and a box of naloxone. Other states may have had that and I may not have noticed, or maybe they didn't. But here I was, an author who had written a book about opiates in Ohio, arriving in Ohio, and it seemed like the box of Narcan on the wall was kind of reminding me of why I was there.
I really appreciated how you went through the stories of the victims at the end. And it is surprising. Well, it's not surprising to me. I think it would be surprising to the general public how young some of these victims were, the families they left behind.
Yeah, it was tremendously important to me to include the stories of the folks who died in this case for many reasons. One, as somebody who reads a lot of true crime and watches a lot of true crime and thought for many years about how I was going to handle my own true crime story, I really value stories that treat victims as full human beings, that
Hmm.
don't just glaze over victims. And that also show them as more than just victims. These were real people who had lives. So I wanted to write that kind of a story. Um, I also wanted to do it because Volkman is remains in denial about what he did and the impact it had.
Yeah.
And this whole book, in many ways, is a fact check and a rebuke of Volkman. And it's a rebuke of Volkman in the way that he very explicitly didn't value the lives of people down there. At one point, an email was submitted as evidence during his trial that he had written at the time, in which he referred to a number of his patients as hillbillies. He spoke
Mm.
disparagingly about Portsmouth and about the region. He was clearly a guy who didn't view them as human beings with full value, and I wanted to do that to offer a rebuke to that. But also, by the time this book came out in 2024, earlier this year, the statistics around lives lost to opiates in this country are just staggering. And I think we can't help but become numb to them. And here I
Yeah.
had an opportunity to put a human face on 11, 12, 13 of those folks and show in my own little way in this small story from a much bigger crisis, to put a human face on the victims here. And so again, it was really important for me to do that.
Well, thank you for doing it.
Appreciate that.
So, what are any next projects? I know it's hard. You just had this book out this year, but do you think you will still continue with the opioid epidemic or
Yes and no.
no?
I think now that I have, this is my first book. It's a book that
Yeah.
took a more than a decade of my life and career, and I have to an extent this expertise and this interest in this subject, and I will continue to report on the opiate epidemic. I have new things that strike my curiosity. I have questions I want to ask. I have um, opinion pieces to write. I mean, I'm working on a piece now about increasing access to treatment. I
Okay.
have other ideas about the opiate epidemic that I want to explore. And of course, tragically, it's an ongoing story. This book is about a particular part of the opiate epidemic that is mostly over, the kind of pill mill and the prescription drug driven part of it. But the overall crisis continues, as the name of your podcast and the subject indicates. Um, but with that said, my next book idea is not about opiates. In the course of my research for this book, I was basically forced to file a Freedom of Information Act request for the evidence from Volkman's trial,
Okay.
which for a trial this long was hundreds of exhibits, which amounted to thousands of pages, also videos, photos. And I thought this was shown in open court. It shouldn't be that hard to access it. I was wrong. I had to file a FOIA, and the FOIA request, surprise, surprise, wasn't answered super promptly or thoroughly. And I wound up having to enlist the help of my local ACLU in Rhode Island to help me sue the Drug Enforcement Administration. And this whole experience, which I'm describing in a couple minutes, lasted years, right? And in the process, I got really interested and angry about the Freedom of Information Act. And I learned that nobody's really written a history of the law for a regular, everyday, non-expert audience. And I think
Hmm.
there's maybe a fool's errand to try to write a book that makes the FOIA interesting and lively, because it is definitely a nerdy topic, but I would like to take that on to try to write a kind of popular history of the Freedom of Information Act.
That does sound interesting.
I hope so.
Well, well, Philip, where can our listeners find you or
They
follow
can
you?
find me on social media. They can find me if they're in Rhode Island or New England. I have some events around here coming up in Rhode Island and Massachusetts. They can hopefully find my book in their local bookstore or library. And if they don't, they can always ask their bookstore or library to order it. And of course, it's also available at all the big retailers as well, online at Amazon and Barnes & Noble and so on. But they can also find me on virtually every social media platform with a lot of cat photo content, I must note. I'm on Twitter, I'm on Instagram, I'm on TikTok, LinkedIn, you name it. They can find me there. And I always look forward to hearing from folks.
Well, thank you for coming on The Poisoning, and have a great day, Philip.
Thank you so much, Erin, and thank you for creating this podcast. It's a really urgent topic, and I appreciate you shining light on it.